Jerusalem, in the season of war. The city was alive with the sounds of duty, soldiers marching, servants carrying water, traders shouting in the streets. But the throne room of Israel was silent. King David sat alone. His commanders had gone to battle. Uriah, the Hittite, one of his best warriors, was at the front lines, fighting for Israel. But David, the warrior king, had chosen to stay behind. A man restless, pacing. A man powerful, but unsatisfied. That evening, as the sun bled across the rooftops, David stepped onto his balcony. The cool wind brushed against his skin, carrying the distant voices of the city below. And then, he saw her. A woman, bathing under the open sky. The glow of lanterns flickered against the water, tracing the curves of her form. She was unaware of the eyes that watched her. David did not turn away. He stood frozen, watching as the water poured over her skin. A whisper in his mind said, "Walk away." But another voice, darker, more insistent, said, "You are the king. You can have anything you desire." His heart pounded. He turned to his servant. "Who is she?" The servant hesitated. "That is Bathsheba, wife of Uriah the Hittite." A pause. A warning. But David ignored it. "Bring her to me." Bathsheba entered cautiously. She had heard the summons. The king of Israel had called for her. But why? David was waiting. His gaze lingered too long. "You are beautiful," he murmured. Bathsheba lowered her eyes. "My lord, why have you called for me?" The silence stretched between them, a silence that carried the weight of a choice. David reached for her hand, and she did not resist. Days later, a message arrived. A simple piece of parchment. But the words written upon it shattered the illusion of secrecy. "I am with child." David's grip tightened on the letter. His mind raced. No one must know. He had made a mistake. A king was meant to be wise. A king was meant to be just. But he had acted like a common thief, stealing what was not his. But kings had power, and power could cover sins. He summoned Uriah from the battlefield. The soldier entered, battle-worn and loyal. He knelt before David, unaware of the betrayal sitting on the throne before him. "You have served me well," David said. "Go home. Rest. Be with your wife." But Uriah shook his head. "My brothers sleep on the battlefield, my lord. How can I lie with my wife while the ark of God remains in a tent?" A heavy silence filled the room. David forced a smile. "Then stay and dine with me." Wine was poured. Cups were emptied. But even as the night deepened, Uriah remained faithful. He slept at the palace gates, refusing the comforts of home while his fellow soldiers fought. David's plan had failed. So he devised another. He wrote a letter to his commander, Joab. A few words sealed with the royal seal. "Place Uriah at the front of the battle. Then withdraw. Let him fall." He folded the parchment and handed it to Uriah himself. The loyal soldier took the letter without question, carrying his own death sentence back to the battlefield. The horns of battle echoed through the valley. Uriah charged forward, sword raised, heart steady. But behind him, the soldiers withdrew. He turned, confusion flickering across his face. And then, the first arrow struck. He stumbled. Another pierced his chest. He fell, the dust swallowing his cries. And the battlefield moved on. The palace. A messenger arrived. Uriah the Hittite is dead. David released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The secret was buried. His hands were clean. Or so he thought. One morning, Nathan the prophet entered the throne room. His face was grim. His eyes piercing. There were two men in a city, he began. One rich, one poor. The rich man had flocks beyond number. The poor man had only one lamb, his beloved companion. But one day, the rich man, unwilling to take from his own flock, stole the poor man's lamb and slaughtered it for himself. David's jaw clenched. His fists tightened. The man who did this deserves to die. Nathan's voice cut through the air. You are that man. Silence. A silence so deep it felt like the heavens themselves were waiting. Then, David's face crumbled. The weight of his actions crushed him. I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan's voice softened. The Lord has taken away your sin. You will not die, but the child born to you will. The price of sin. Days passed. The child fell ill. David fasted, wept, pleaded with God. But on the seventh day, the child died. David did not scream, did not rage. He rose, washed, changed his clothes, and he worshipped. The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Blessed be his name. Time passed. From the ashes of sin, a new life was given. Bathsheba bore another son, Solomon, a child destined for wisdom, a child who would one day build the temple of the Lord. David had fallen, but God's mercy was greater than his failure. For even kings must bow before the King of Heaven. Closing reflection. A story of power, desire, and consequence. A story of sin and redemption. David, the man after God's own heart, was not perfect, but even in his deepest failure, he found grace. For the greatest lesson of his life was not in his victories, but in his repentance. And in that, we find hope.